The Sioux Naturalists are, of course, our sponsor tonight. They help make this whole evening possible. I'm Susan James, Assistant Director here at Bayliss Library. And I have the usual thank yous and events to mention. Thank you, of course, to Loreen Niewenhuis for coming tonight, and for Greg Zimmerman, who's in the audience, for suggesting her as a speaker. Also the program committee and the Friends of the Library for the refreshments. Next week is the summer book sale on Friday and Saturday, 9 to 4 on Friday and 9 to 1 on Saturday. And a special feature of the Saturday sale is Steve Hamilton will be here, the author. He'll speak about his new book, Let It Burn, and it will be available for purchase. That will be 11 o'clock on a week from Saturday. Hope to see you there. We're pleased to have Loreen Niewenhuis with us tonight on our tour of the UP. She's touring 3 of the Superior District Library member libraries and a 4th library. Yesterday she was in Cedarville. Tomorrow she'll be in Newberry, and then Saturday in Engadine. She has a Bachelor's of Science from Calvin College, a Master's of Science from Wayne State, and a Master's of Fine Arts from Spalding University in Kentucky. Is that right? Okay. She currently lives in Battle Creek. She's the author of 1,000-Mile Great Lakes Walk, winner of the Great Lakes Great Reads Award, 1,000-Mile Walk on the Beach, winner of Best Nonfiction Beach Read in 2012, the novella Atlanta, and many literary short stories. She was a finalist for the Flannery O'Connor Award for Short Fiction in 2009 for her collection of short stories titled Scar Tissue. Tonight she'll speak about 1,000-Mile Great Lakes Walk. Her books are available for purchase over there and signing tonight. So please welcome Loreen Niewenhuis.
Because I tend to walk around a little bit. That's okay. Thank you, Carl, and the Sioux Naturalists for sponsoring me, and Bayliss Library and Susan for bringing me here. I'm just thrilled to be up here in the UP, the gorgeous UP. I've done a lot of touring around the Midwest, and this is my first foray over the bridge to tour with my books. I have come over the bridge to explore the Great Lakes, and I'm going to talk to you about that tonight. My first adventure was walking all the way around Lake Michigan. I kind of had a bit of a midlife crisis when I turned 45 years old, and I thought I needed to take on a very big challenge, and it was either a crime spree or I looked to my favorite place, Lake Michigan. I decided to get to know it step by step, not just the pretty beaches, but to get to know it completely by walking all the way around it. I began in Chicago. At the tail end of winter, I went around the bottom of the lake first and headed up the west side of Michigan. At the end of that portion, I was finally not in so much pain. I continued up the west side of Michigan, and around that time, I was having the time of my life, and I started calling it the adventure of a lifetime. And I headed north, over the bridge, along the bottom of the Upper Peninsula. And then as I got closer and closer to the finish line in Chicago, I thought, this cannot be the only adventure. I'm having way too much fun. I'm learning so much about the Great Lakes, about Lake Michigan specifically, and meeting fascinating people, interviewing scientists, interviewing steel mill workers, charter boat captains, people who make their living on the lake. I thought, this can't be the only one, and I had learned so much about Lake Michigan, I decided for my next adventure to touch all 5 Great Lakes and to learn how they work as a system. Superior, as you very well know up here, flows into Lake Huron through the St. Mary's River, Lake Michigan through the Straits into Huron. Huron and Erie are connected through a very elaborate connection. This is the St. Clair River flowing into Lake St. Clair, the Detroit River, and then Lake Erie pushes water to the northeast, straight north up the Niagara River, and then Lake Ontario flows into the St. Lawrence River. The water at that point has another 700 plus miles before it merges with the North Atlantic. So this water is on a slow but persistent journey to the ocean. These numbers represent the mean amount of time any drop of water will spend in any given Great Lake. and the numbers are in years. You can see that Lake Superior is holding on to water a lot longer than the lower Great Lakes. But these numbers should give us pause when we think about the BP oil refinery in Whiting, Indiana, which legally dumps into Lake Michigan every day. That is not being whisked away. It is staying in Lake Michigan for a lifetime. And even if it was being whisked away, do we want to throw everything into the ocean? These are some of the questions and problems that I discovered on my hikes. So for my second adventure, I decided to move with these waters for a time, to get to know the individual lakes, to explore the geology, to find out how people were relating to the Great Lakes on all sides. I began last April in Port Clinton, Ohio, headed back into Michigan, and then all the way up Michigan's Sunrise side in the Lower Peninsula. I retraced some of my steps along Lake Michigan. I had to do pictured rocks, right? Along Lake Superior. I had seen it from the boats a couple times, but never hiked the entire length. I hiked it end to end. I also wanted to explore the Keweenaw. There are entire books written about the Keweenaw, the geology there. It's fascinating, so I wanted to get up there. I thought it only fitting to explore Lake Ontario from the Ontario side of the lake to see how our Canadian neighbors to the north are treating the lakes. The state of Michigan touches 4 Great Lakes, as does the province of Ontario. So I hiked all the way from Belleville west to Toronto. Toronto is the second largest city in the basin, Chicago being the first. For my finish line, I could think of no more dramatic finish line than the Horseshoe Falls at Niagara. So that's where I had the finale of this adventure. I did this in 6 segments spread over 7 months last year. I did 1,004 miles total in 76 days of hiking, averaging 13 miles a day. My longest day was 27 miles, and I felt that day for several days after. My shortest day was only 9 miles, but it was 95 degrees, and all the stable flies had hatched that day. And I'm going to call that day memorable, and I'll show you a clip of video from that day, but we're calling it memorable. The Great Lakes were formed by a series of glaciers, these continental glaciers that came down from the north, carving out the basins for the lakes and then melting and filling them with fresh water. The last ice sheet retreated about 10,000 years ago. You probably know that already. What you may not have a handle on is how immense these ice sheets were. This is the pier at Grand Haven, Michigan. If that ice sheet was there today and the leading edge was at the pier, the sky would be filled with ice. These ice sheets were 1 to 2 miles tall. This gives you some idea of the forces that came to bear on this region to shape and give us our Great Lakes. Imagine the weight of that ice. That ice was so heavy that the northern region, north of here, even in the UP, it was depressed from the weight of that ice. And the upper lakes flowed to the north for thousands of years after that last ice sheet retreated. On my first hike, I became fascinated with the geology of the Great Lakes. I would be hiking on sandy beach for days, and then it would transition into slate and shale, and then all of a sudden I was on limestone for days. So I wondered what was going on. In many places in the nation, there are layers, and as you dig down, you're getting to older and older layers, and you have to dig down to find the older layers. In the Great Lakes, you don't have to dig down because the layers are not flat on top of each other. They have been deformed, like a nested bowl formation. That's what it's called. So you can see that the bottom layer is actually flipped up. All the layers are flipped up. So as you get out from the center, you're actually seeing older layers exposed at the surface. And if we go back to this image, you can see that the sandstone bluffs up on pictured rocks, they are hundreds of millions of years older geologically than what you'll see exposed at the center of Michigan. I began my hike in April of last year. Started down in Port Clinton, Ohio, and I hiked 302 miles in the month of April through that elaborate connection through downtown Detroit and all the way up around the thumb, and I ended in Bay City. Lake Erie, if you've been to western Lake Erie, it looks muddy. That's because those glaciers deposited an awful lot of clay and silt and ground up rock in the basin of Lake Erie and also in the river valleys. The Maumee River is constantly taking clay and silt and putting it into Lake Erie. So that's why you get this brown color. For thousands of years after the glaciers retreated, this area, this red area here, developed into a massive primordial swamp. It was called the Great Black Swamp. It was 1 million acres of dense, almost impassable swamp. People entered the swamp and were never heard from again. When people were trying to get out of Ohio and settle into Michigan and into Indiana, this was a huge barrier for them because it was so fearful. It was a frightening place. Out of that 1 million acres that was that primordial swamp, there's about 12,000 acres today still preserved as that natural swampy area. One of the areas is the McGee Marsh Wildlife Area. This is one of the premier birding sites in North America. There's 1 week in April. If you're there the whole week, it's not unusual to see 200 species of birds flying through, and I think they have a dozen warblers that go through there. Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge is also protecting a large portion of land there. Since the shoreline there was quite swampy, I had to walk along roads that were near the lake most of the time, and many of these roads were paralleled with these deep drainage ditches because they are still pulling the water from the land and putting it into these ditches and systematically pumping it out to Lake Erie. When I was hiking one day, it rained very hard, and this big pond bloomed, and it was deep enough that all these swan landed and started paddling around. This land wants to return to that primordial swamp. If we stopped intervening, it would become the Great Black Swamp again. Lake Erie is the youngest Great Lake. For the time after the glaciers retreated, as I mentioned, the upper lakes flowed to the north. They weren't even flowing through Lake Erie. Lake Erie was kind of a floodplain and rather stagnant. It took a couple thousand years before the lakes kind of hooked up the way they are today. I hiked north back into Michigan and along the Detroit River. On my hikes, I don't want to take you just to the pretty places. You live in the pretty places, but I want to take you in my books to places that are less traveled, like the Rouge River. The Rouge River has the designation of the distinction of being one of the 4 rivers in the Great Lake Basin to have burst into flames. The Chicago River, the Cuyahoga, and the Buffalo are the other 3. I hiked through a lot of abandoned industry, a lot of just very, very post-apocalyptic sort of places. I hiked all the way into Detroit, under the Ambassador Bridge, along the Detroit River. They have developed the Detroit River recently. There's a couple miles of this beautiful river walk. And it seems anytime you give people access to the edge of the water, they will return. And this is one of the best hopeful signs I saw for Detroit while I was hiking through. Lake St. Clair is basically a floodplain between the 2 rivers, the St. Clair River and the Detroit River. The average depth of Lake St. Clair is 11 feet. You can see where the tugboat is moving, it's green, it's a different color. That's because that's the shipping channel. It is dredged, it is actively dredged, so the lake freighters that you see gliding by here can also make it through Lake St. Clair. There's a lot of Phragmites, this invasive grass growing along Lake St. Clair. And this lake is also where the zebra mussels were first dumped in the 80s, and it took about 15 years for them to spread throughout the Great Lakes Basin and also into the Mississippi watershed. The St. Clair River is the last part of this elaborate connection, and there is a trail associated with the river there, so I hiked on that trail most of the way by the river. It's a wonderful place to watch the freighters, not as dramatic as your locks right here, but there were times that the freighters were close enough to throw a rock at and hit the side, but they frown on that apparently. And you probably know about boatnerd.com because the visitor center here is keyed into boatnerd.com, and you can track in real time the location of all the lake freighters, what they're hauling, where they got their cargo, and where they're taking their cargo. It's fascinating. The city of Port Huron is located where Lake Huron flows into the river there. This is the boyhood home of Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison hated this town, though. He wrote letters to his dad, "Why don't you leave there? The people are horrible." I mean, really. But they still claim him as their favorite son, their native son there. The Canadian side of the river is very industrialized. It's called Canada's Chemical Valley. They are responsible for dumping into the river quite a bit, and it is an area of concern, and the EPA is in the process of cleaning that up. It's a beautiful place with the Blue Water Bridge to watch the freighters gliding by. So Port Huron and the Blue Water Bridge are behind me, and I'm now on the shores of beautiful Lake Huron. Yay! I'm a lake walker. I'm not a river walker. I feel a little hemmed in by the river, so I'm always happy to get back to the big water. I continued up Michigan's Thumb. This is the Point aux Barques lighthouse near the tip. Point aux Barques is French for point of little boats. And I love that sign. It's so clear, is it not? When I looked over the edge, though, the shoreline was strewn with little stick people. They were broken.
Oh.
So they're not listening. It's very clear, but they're not listening. It was incredibly windy last April. I don't know if it was windy up here, but it was so windy on the Thumb at times that I had to crouch down underneath my backpack in order to not be blown into the lake. It was just incredibly windy. They're putting up wind farms on the Thumb. The Thumb is quite flat. For a time after the glaciers retreated, the Thumb was still underwater while the rest of the state was not. So the Thumb actually got leveled out a lot more than the rest of the state. So it's a wonderful place to put the wind farms. I hiked on M25 when I could not be at the water's edge, but once I hit the tip of the Thumb, I was able to hike this rugged sandy beach west from Port Austin. From that point, I had a 3-day hike to Bay City, all along the inside of Saginaw Bay. Saginaw Bay is shallow. As a bay, it is protected, and it is the perfect habitat for this invasive grass again, Phragmites. And Phragmites is basically choking off Saginaw Bay. I stayed at a B&B along this stretch with a woman who had lived her entire life along Saginaw Bay. She was 85 years old. She said 10 years ago there wasn't a strand of Phragmites there. So in 10 years it has basically taken over the bay there. And I can't imagine they'll ever be rid of it. I took a little break after that first 302 miles, and then I returned to the hike after the break. I went to Bay City again, headed north, up the Sunrise Coast there, all the way to Mackinac, and I had a little extra time, so I actually curved around the top and touched a little bit of Lake Michigan again. The first part of this hike was, again, along the inside of Saginaw Bay. Since the lakes are so low right now, the bay is also low, and there were places where Saginaw Bay was basically a mud flat as far as I could see. The bay has always had beautiful habitat for waterfowl, egrets and swans. Saw this wonderful little swan family there. I continued north, passing through the town of Pinconning, which is known for their cheese and their giant mouse sculpture. I couldn't be on the shoreline much of this way because it was so muddy and marshy, so I was on North 23 most of that way, or on smaller roads closer to the lake or to the bay. I found this rare wood turtle on the Augrey River. It's a threatened species, and this is the first one I had seen in the wild. So we had a little talk. One of the natural resources that Douglas Houghton was charged with finding after Michigan became a state was alabaster or gypsum. He was a geologist, so he was looking for iron and copper and salt deposits, but he was also looking for alabaster. But gypsum is the dry stuff in drywall now. That's what it's primarily used for now. Back then it was a plastering agent, and they would also sow it into fields that were too acidic, and it would correct the pH. And they could grow crops in these fields. So it was kind of a magical thing, and it was very valuable back then. They used to have a conveyor system to take the gypsum out to the shed there and then load it onto ships. But today there's a modern pipeline that takes it right out to load onto the ships. You can see on this map the town of Alabaster and Port Gypsum. That deposit is all along there, still being mined today, even though it was found in the early 1800s. I continued around the top of Saginaw Bay and then came down Tawas Point. Tawas Point is a state park, beautiful state park. I hiked down to the point and then back along Lake Huron, finally back by the big lake. This is another stopping point for a lot of migrating birds, and they had oranges out for the orioles, which were stopping in. Amphibians are sensitive to changes in the environment, changes in pH, changes with pollution. So I was thrilled anytime I saw these shallow pools filled with thousands of tadpoles. It's just a really good indication that the environment in that area had not been corrupted in any way. This is the Ausable River, which flows into Lake Huron at the town of Oscoda. If you were standing in this spot in 1910, you would have seen nothing but stumps. That's because any river within the Great Lakes Basin has a history associated with the lumbering phase in the Great Lakes Basin. There's a beautiful monument here to the work of the lumbermen, and the inscription there reads, "Erected to perpetuate the memory of the pioneer lumbermen of Michigan, through whose labors was made possible the development of the prairie states." We don't think about where all that wood went, but it was actually shipped west with settlers going to the Great Plains where there were no trees to create towns and houses. The largest sandy stretch that I saw along this part of the hike was between Oscoda and Harrisville. It's pretty much sandy the entire way. This round goby had washed up there. This is another invasive species brought in ballast water. It's a bully fish. It will attack other native species, and it spawns up to 6 times a year. So it has an advantage over our native fish. As I continued north, I came upon a lot of limestone. I was hitting that limestone layer exposed at the surface. You see the frog there? This was June, so all the wildflowers were in bloom. The lilies, the harebells or bluebells. As you can see there, I have my big pack on my back. Once I started hiking in June, it was warm enough that I had my camping gear with me the entire way, and I always had the option to camp. I did camp in Negregon State Park, a very remote state park. It only has 4 camping sites, and they're all right on the shoreline. If you read my first book, I had some misadventures with my hammock tent, but I still love my hammock tent. Gets me up off the ground. The darker part on top is actually a rainfly, and this night was so mild and calm and there was no threat of rain that I took the rainfly off and watched the sunset and then actually watched the stars come out. The town of Ottameek also has a monument to the lumbering phase. This is Paul, and if you're going to have Paul, you got to have Babe. As I kept going north, I came across a large shale layer and slate layer exposed at the surface. This was near Squaw Bay. The Nature Conservancy has stepped in and preserved much of Squaw Bay, which is wonderful because this is an incredibly biodiverse area. I saw many different types of freshwater shellfish in this area, more types in one area than I had seen anywhere else on the lakes. And again, the frogs were thriving, the fish, the birds. North of Alpena, there's an abandoned quarry, the Rockport Quarry. This is where they pulled all the limestone in order to build the Mighty Mac Bridge. This land has been conferred to the state. It is our newest state park, but the land is quite altered here. You can see the tailings of the mining operation and some rusting equipment sticking out of that pile. So it's kind of an interesting place to go. A lot of fossil hunters go there and they blog about where in the mine to go to find creatures from different eons. It's kind of fascinating. I found this I visited with this baby groundhog when I was there. I've seen adult groundhog my entire life. I've watched them many times, but this is the first baby I've seen, so I have no idea how they hide them for so long, but we had a little chat. He was quite friendly and not afraid, which was nice. And lest you think this was a walk on the beach this time, this is some of the hiking from last year. I'm a bit of a rock hound, so at least the rocks were interesting as I was balancing on top of them. And the boots I'm walking in there are on the table. They have 700 miles on them. Love those boots. I was treated to a couple lines of very active thunderstorms while I was hiking up here in Thompson's Harbor State Park. People quite often ask me, have you ever been afraid out there? And before this day, I could have said, not really, but after this lightning storm, yeah, that's probably the most frightened I've been in the wild. The rain brought out all the wildflowers, though, the Indian paintbrush, the lilies, everything was vibrant, all the temperate orchids, the lady slippers. And anytime it rains, it's easier to find the petoskes, right? This one was as big as a donut. But then as a hiker, all I could think about was having a donut. Near Rogers City, I got a tour of the calcite limestone mine. They've been pulling limestone out of here for 100 years. They estimate there's another 100 years of limestone to be mined here. It's very difficult to get the scale of these machines. Each dump truck load is over 200 tons. When you see me in the shot, it puts things in perspective. They actually let me ride in the truck. They didn't let me drive it. I'm like, let me drive it, come on. And that's me in the loader. It's fascinating. You can see this from space. It is so large. Largest open pit limestone mine on the planet. The next clip is a piece of video from that memorable day, the hot fly-filled day.
So it is on this site, right here where I'm standing, within sight of the 40 Mile Point Lighthouse, that I've reached 500 miles of my trek. Halfway. And I'm on the shores of Lake Huron, just about 7 miles north of Rogers City, which is a lovely little town. If you have not been, go there. They're so friendly there, it's almost scary. I'm kind of wrapped up today, as you can see, even though it's a warm day, because there are these little, they look like houseflies, but they have fangs, so they're biting flies that are swarming today, and it's kind of unpleasant, but if I wrap up and keep moving, they seem to just swarm on my peanuts. Right now I have a couple hundred just hanging out on my hands. This is the halfway moment. I just wanted to stop and kind of look back to Fort Clinton on the shores of Lake Erie. Realize that I've come all the way up back into Michigan along the Detroit River, Lake St. Clair River, and then around the thumb, Saginaw Bay, and now on the beautiful shores of Lake Huron.
Quite a fashion statement, right? This is the lighthouse that I referenced, the 40 Mile Point Lighthouse, kind of unusual in that it's square. You can go up in the tower. Beautiful view from up there, and they have the original Fresnel lens. As I continued north, the moths got larger and larger. This last one is a laurel sphinx. I think I could have ridden it. It's just a gorgeous moth. You grow them big up here. I made it all the way to the Mackinac Bridge. I put this bridge up against any bridge in the world for grace and beauty. Just gorgeous. After taking a little time off, I headed to the next Great Lake, the most superior Great Lake. It was named that because it's geographically above the other lakes, but it's superior in all other measurements. It's the biggest, the deepest, the coldest. Contains more water than the other 4 lakes combined. I wanted to hike Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore end to end, and also explore the Keweenaw. Lake Superior has a wonderful collection of rocks, colorful rocks brought down from the Canadian Shield, tumbled by Lake Superior. It's a wonderful place to be a rock hound. And of course the agates are here. This one obviously has been sliced in half. Agates are formed in old pockets, old air pockets in lava flows. I don't know if you're aware that part of the reason that Lake Superior is so much deeper than the other lakes is because there's a continental rift in the middle of the lake. And hundreds of millions of years ago, that rift opened up and spewed lava for a very long time. And there was so much weight that the crust collapsed, that giving us the extra deep basin for Lake Superior. And in those ancient lava flows, when water goes through the basalt rock, it will deposit silica in voids within the lava flows, in the air pockets. And that silica, over time, over millions of years, can form these beautiful agates. I had seen the Pictured Rocks from the boat a couple times, but never from atop the sandstone bluffs, so it was wonderful to have that perspective. My son Ben joined me for this portion of the hike. He looks tiny there, but he's actually taller than I am. This bunny hopped around our campsite the first night, and as the sun set, it made her ears glow atop her head. The vistas are just amazing from on top of the bluffs. The sandstone here, that's some of the oldest rock you'll see exposed at the surface in Michigan. This is a plant that I read about but never seen in the wild. It's called Indian pipe or ghost plant. It completely lacks chlorophyll. It does not photosynthesize. It's a parasitic plant that feeds on fungi that is in turn feeding on tree roots. So you'll only find it in dense forests. After many miles, the sandstone bluffs subsume into a couple of beautiful coves, and then there is this 12-mile beach in the middle of the National Lakeshore up there. When Ben and I were hiking, it was so hot, and the lake had warmed up so much that we went swimming in Lake Superior every day without getting brain freeze. It was incredibly refreshing. This is the massive perch dune toward the Grand Marais side of the lakeshore. This is where they once had a log slide. They actually built a wooden chute to guide the logs down to the water. And the logs would create so much friction within the wooden chute that the wooden chute would burst into flames at times. After hiking Pictured Rocks, we drove up to the Keweenaw, and if you notice the orientation of the Keweenaw, and then notice Isle Royal, these are actually two edges of a layer that has been flipped up because the land in between collapsed long ago. So those are two edges of the same land formation. So the geology on those two landforms it's almost identical. In Horseshoe Bay, at the tip of the Keweenaw, you'll see this reddish basalt rock everywhere. This is that ancient magma that's iron rich, that's why it has the reddish color. And as you walk closer and closer to the water, you can see what Lake Superior does to those rocks over time. And if you're dubious about the syncline, about this flipping up of the edges of the land there, Ben is standing on a layer of slate, and you can see how it's angled up because it has been flipped up. It's quite dramatic illustration of that syncline, that formation there. After hiking those miles, I went back home, took a little break, and then I headed east to Lake Ontario. Wanted to explore how our Canadian neighbors were treating Lake Ontario. I hiked all the way from the town of Belleville west to Toronto. Before exploring the lakeshore right there, though, I explored an area in between Lakes Huron and Ontario that had been shaped by the Great Lakes long ago, Remember how I mentioned that the upper lakes at one time flowed to the north because the upper region was depressed from the weight of all that ice? Well, over time, the lake leveled out, and then for a short while, it actually flowed directly into Lake Ontario. But when it blasted through there, it wasn't just a river. Scientists theorized that it was held back by a massive ice dam for a while, so the water built up as the land was rebounding. And when it went through there, it was a wall of water about 10 stories tall.
So that wall of water came through here and carved these rocks in a way I haven't seen elsewhere. There are formations here called kettles, and they're formed when all that water came through and whipped around, forming whirlpools, just massive whirlpools. And sometimes they would spin a rock at the bottom of them, or just the force of that whirlpool itself would carve out the limestone here. And I am sitting on one of the kettles now, on the rim of one of them. My legs are dangling down into it. And I'm going to turn the camera now. You can see, the smoothed walls of this kettle whipping around and around until it finally bore a hole all the way through the bottom. It's a fascinating formation.
That was the largest kettle I saw there, but there were many different sizes, from that big to a couple of fingers width wide, drilled all over in the limestone there. And the land had been lifted up in places, and that wall of water drilled under some of these slabs of limestone, so there are caves that you can go into there. This is the Warsaw Caves Conservation Area in Ontario. It's fascinating to go through there, and it's very obvious how the Great Lakes at one time blasted through there and reshaped this land. So after exploring this fascinating place, I headed to the lakeshore, and then I hiked the waterfront trail all the way from Belleville to Toronto. Ontario is establishing a waterfront trail all the way from Montreal to Windsor. You can go from Montreal all the way to just across the river from Buffalo now. I believe it's all established, and they're working on continuing it to Windsor. I got another limestone mine tour. Never turned down a mine tour. They're fascinating. You can see here how they're drilling holes along the wall. They put charges in there and then actually explode the wall of limestone into the pit. Then they gather that limestone. Every single bit of limestone from this mine goes onto this ship, and the ship makes a constant route between the mine and a cement plant on the other side of Toronto. So this lake freighter is making a constant loop. Much of the early part of this lakeshore walk was agrarian, but in Ontario, landowners can own right up to the water's edge. There is no public corridor to walk. So I stayed on the trail most of the way. Any place there was a public corridor, a park, a boat launch, I did get back to that water's edge whenever possible. There were some beautiful overlooks on the lake. There were wonderful wild areas. And the waterfront trail also went through some historic towns. And then it wound right through a nuclear power plant buffer zone. It was all fenced off, but you could legally walk through there. There were some construction zones and some abandoned places. Sometimes the path went between the high tension, high voltage wires. And then the path would do this. Later that day, so it was a very mixed experience all the way to Toronto. But I really respect the Canadians for giving people access to go right through whatever's happening at the waterfront. because the more people know about what's happening at their waterfront, the more involved they can be about the decisions about what's happening there. So I made it all the way to the beaches of Toronto. These are some of the cleanest beaches, urban beaches, within the basin. Toronto has done a wonderful job of restoring wetlands and protecting their water quality there. And that's downtown Toronto. For the bulk of my remaining miles, I returned to Lake Michigan and retraced some of my steps along the Leelanau Peninsula, then all the way down to Ludington. And I also spent some time on the Manitou Islands. The Manitou Islands are part of the Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. This is Leland, Fishtown in Leland on the Leelanau Peninsula. This is the lighthouse at the tip of the Leelanau. I saw one of the most dramatic sunsets of my life on the Leelanau. It was like Mars was showing up. It was fantastic. In 2009, when I hiked this area, I could not be at the shoreline for the entire stretch of the Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. In 2012, the lakes were so low that it was completely walkable. I walked the entire 35 miles at the shoreline. There are many perch dunes along this national lakeshore, and walking at the foot of them, it's quite obvious that these are living dunes. They're still subject to gravity and wind and waves. These perch dunes have the disquieting habit of sloughing off several acres every once in a while into the lake, and I always kept my fingers crossed that that wouldn't happen when I was walking at the base of them. You can see how the sand is, or the wind is sculpting the top of this dune. It's quite beautiful, quite dynamic. It's always changing. This is my favorite overview in Sleeping Bear Dunes. This is the Empire Bluff Trail, looking out on Platte Bay, north to Sleeping Bear Dune, and that's South Manitou Island offshore. Was featured in one of those Pure Michigan ads a while ago. Just a beautiful vista. For the finale, I chose the place to best visualize that this water is indeed moving through the system, and that's Niagara Falls. I invited people to join me for a 2-day hike from Niagara on the Lake to the Horseshoe Falls. This is the group that hiked with me the first day. We hiked 8 miles. Several people were hobbled by that and could not join me the next day. But this is the group the second day. They were very enthusiastic. The Niagara Falls, it's a magnificent place where the water from Lake Erie takes a plunge over the Niagara Escarpment. The Niagara Escarpment is a hardened layer of limestone. It's been hardened with magnesium, and it actually runs in an arc through the upper Great Lakes there. Many of the structures that this geological layer goes through are there today because of this hardened limestone. These islands and peninsulas withstood the onslaught of the glaciers because of this dolomitic limestone. And I have to show you the falls, right? So I just told you all about a 1,000-mile Great Lakes walk. That book just won the Great Lakes Great Reads Award. I'm very proud of that. And my first book is A 1,000-Mile Walk on the Beach. Be happy to answer any questions you have at this point. Comments, assertions? Yes?
The logistics behind something like this has got to be awesome.
Yeah.
And arranging for lodging or campsites, food, all the other things, emergencies, shoes. How much time did that entail?
On my first hike, I did that hike in 10 segments. So, and the first few segments were very short, 5 days, 3 days, 3 days. So I kind of got into the habit of being able to focus on just a few days and plan that. So I learned a lot on my first hike, what to carry, what not to carry. And I could plan those short segments very efficiently. On the second hike, I had learned an awful lot, and I was hiking for a month at a time. So I might plot out where I was going to be for 5 days, and then as I continued, then I would start researching the next 5 days and where I would stay or where I would camp. So there was a lot of planning in the moment, and there was a lot of planning ahead of time. So the logistics were quite elaborate at times, and there was a lot of problem solving in the moment. If I came upon an obstacle that I didn't see in the satellite images or maps, it might take me longer to get to a destination than I thought. Yeah, I just had to deal with things as I came.
Did you take your tent and your bag, your sleeping bag with you most of the time, anticipating that you might need it and not get to your destination for an overnight facility?
After April, I did that. First, around the thumb to Bay City, that was done in April, and it was quite chilly in April, so I had places to stay that entire month. After that month, I had my big pack the entire time, so I always had the option of camping, and I did do some camping in non-campgrounds, just very remote places where I could be next to the lake, and I just practiced, leave no trace.
Yep.
Yeah. Way in the back.
The waterfront trail, is that, okay, between Toronto and Windsor, is that complete?
No, it is complete from Montreal to Toronto, and I believe all the way to the other side of the river on Buffalo. It goes along the Niagara River.
Okay.
And then they're extending it, they're establishing it. Now the waterfront trail, most of the way where I hiked, it was the side of the road. It wasn't necessarily, well, you saw some of the paths. There were some that were paths that were designated. Not always through a wild area though. But the majority of the way was a widened shoulder. And that trail is actually used primarily by bicyclists. I had many people tell me I was the first hiker they saw on that trail.
But the part, like from Montreal to Toronto and then to Buffalo, is that part trail or the side of the road?
It's both.
Okay.
It changes, and you can go onto their website. If you Google that, they'll show you the trail and the different segments and what to expect along the way. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
When you were camping, how much did your pack weigh?
About 35 pounds, most of that way. Yeah. Yeah. I can lift a car now, so if you're pinned, let me call. Yes.
You mentioned Ludington, Michigan.
Yes.
I didn't the connection.
That was where I ended my Lake Michigan segment of hiking. That was the end of my Lake Michigan hike.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. By Big Sabo, by the lighthouse there. That's where I ended that
I used to
segment.
live there one time.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's beautiful. I also did the Skyline Trail there, which takes you up a dune very quickly. You can see for a long way. Yeah, it's beautiful. Yes. Yes.
Do you have plans to hike more of Lake Superior?
I have plans for a third adventure that will explore the islands of the Great Lakes, and I will explore islands in every Great Lake. The Apostle Islands and Isle Royale are on my list. It will be hiking, kayaking, and biking. So the Apostles obviously will be a great kayaking adventure. I will hike on Isle Royale. So yeah. The problem with Lake Superior is that it's so wild and there's so much primordial forest. There are many trails, like the Waterfront Trail in Canada, in Ontario. I've talked to people who have hiked that, and even though it's called the Waterfront Trail, you can't see the lake most of the time because the forest is so dense. So I like being right at that water's edge wherever possible. Yes?
What sort of things did you take to eat?
Always had chocolate. I get grumpy without chocolate. I have a little cook stove, so I always had oatmeal for breakfast, and then I would have dehydrated meals for dinner. Yeah. Oh, and the instant potatoes, you can pick those up anywhere. Love those. Mashed potatoes.
You mentioned going about 5 days and then kind of reconnoitering to do
Yeah.
the next few days.
Yeah.
Were you connected with cell phone or computer or how?
I had an iPad for part of this adventure last year until it got flooded, and then it didn't work. It wasn't happy. So that was useful until it wasn't useful. I carry a cell phone with me, but in most of these areas I'm hiking, anytime you have a dune between you and a cell tower, you're not getting any signal. So that's when it was wonderful to have my gear with me. So if I was in the wild and, I didn't know what was around me, or, it was gonna be another 2 days before I got to a city, I could just camp. Yes?
Did you have friends who could support
I have
you
friends.
by car?
Lots of friends.
You made a lot of friends, too. Did you have some support by car, people meeting you?
People would drive me to the beginning of a section and then pick me up after, and I took a bus, one place to start another adventure. My sister and my cousin would always drive me if I would take them to brunch when we got there, so I treated them to brunch. And, yeah, so I had people picking me up and taking me back. Actually, the Lake Michigan portion of this hike, I had my car, so I would have people advance the car, or I would hike to a bed and breakfast and then say, I'll stay here, but we have to go get my car. So people helped me that way. Yes?
Were you ever afraid? I saw that deep hole, and I thought, were you ever really afraid?
What deep hole, the mine?
The kettle.
Oh, the kettle. Oh, that, I almost wanted to slide down to the bottom, but thought I might get stuck, and then that's just embarrassing. I was afraid in the lightning storm. That was the most active lightning storm I have ever been in, and I was outside, and I was walking with a metal pole at that time, a metal collapsible pole, and the scientific part of my brain said, aluminum is not a good conductor of electricity, and the other side of my brain said, get it away from you! So I actually came upon a truck parked at a trailhead, and I jumped up on the back of the truck just to have the tires between me and the ground. The thunder did not stop for 5 minutes. It just rolled into the next one, and the crashing was like immediate. So, yeah, I was afraid then. You had a question.
Yeah, you had said initially that a midlife crisis is what prompted this
Yes.
quest.
Yes.
So how have your two walks changed?
They've kind of removed any walls or barriers I thought I had, limitations in my life. When I say I've hiked 2,000 miles and I say it out loud, it sounds crazy to me. I'm not one of these people that has to run 10 miles a day to feel alive. I feel quite alive without that. So it has opened up the way I look at my future and what I can accomplish. And the logistics and the problem solving along the way has given me a lot more confidence in just handling everything that comes my way. Yes?
Speaking of those kettles, there's two prominent areas for kettles in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Loreen, are you familiar with those two?
I've heard about them. Yeah, and I've heard in Minnesota there are kettles as big as a truck,
I
like
think
huge.
St. Croix there's some
Okay.
in that area.
Yeah, these are the first I'd seen in person, and I was just floored. Just amazing.
Quite impressive geologically.
It is.
Yes.
It is. Yeah. And this was just recently protected as a conservation area. It was privately owned, and you want these areas to be protected for everybody, and the geology preserved. Way in the back.
If somebody were to ask you what is the most spectacular area of lake shore along the Great Lakes that you've seen, where's your vote?
Sault Ste. Marie. My heart loves Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore, but Pictured Rocks is just magnificent. So it's a tie for those two at this point.
That's interesting because those are the two that I would have picked.
Okay.
And I've seen a whole lot less of it than what you have.
Yeah. Yes.
Did you?
I have friends.
Did you visit the Manitou Islands?
I did last year. I camped on North for 4 days and then just visited briefly South Manitou. For my island adventure though, just this month I spent a week on the Manitous helping with the piping plover research. One component I have with the next book is to take part in some scientific research. I have a background in the sciences, and that just kind of fits with me and takes you to the islands, and not just on a hike or kayaking adventure. It lets you know what's going on there with the wildlife. So they had 9 nesting pairs on North and 1 on South, and I helped observe both populations.
Where are you from originally?
I grew up in the Metro Detroit area, Plymouth and South Lyon. I currently live in Battle Creek, Michigan. Yeah. I need to get closer to the lakes, though. In the middle. Yes.
What about your experience with wildlife, and particularly aggressive wildlife?
I saw bear tracks, but I'd never seen a bear. I'm actually not afraid of bear as much as I am of cougar. They had signs up in 2009 about cougar and Sleeping Bear Dunes. They'll bite you in the back of the neck. You won't even see them coming. And I was actually afraid that a cougar was tracking me at one point in Sleeping Bear Dunes. But other than that, I mean, I almost stepped on a baby deer, a fawn once, but I never came across aggressive deer or any other animals that were aggressive. Well, I have books, I have boots. I'm happy to hang out and answer more questions or talk to you about the lakes. Thank you again for bringing me up here. I really enjoyed it and enjoyed my time visiting. So thank you all for coming.